Hello. In the previous lecture, I talked about how the echo signal is created and processed. In this lecture, I'll be covering the second half of the processing in the ultrasound machine, which takes the echo, positions it in the correct place, and builds up an image. The first component of the machine I'll be talking about is the scan converter. This has the job of placing each echo in the correct place in the image memory. It has a second task as well, and that is to find any locations in the image memory, any pixels, in other words, which don't have echo data written to them. This can happen if the scan lines are stepping by too large an interval between one transmit pulse and the next. Some of the pixels may be missing data. So the scan converter calculates a best estimate of the missing values and places them in those locations. It does this using mathematical interpolation. There are no controls directly on the scan converter, but it is affected by many parameters of the machine. I mentioned the interpolation, the filling in of gaps. On the left, we have a very early grayscale image of the abdomen, taken in fact in my research group in Sydney many years ago. In those days, the machines did not have the capability of filling in the missing data, and you can see how obvious the scan lines are in this image and how distracting they are. In a modern image on the right, of course, you're not even aware of the direction of the scan lines, unless you happen to have artifacts such as shadowing to tell you the direction. The image memory is simply an area in the machine's digital storage, and it's going to contain a representation of an image. So we can think of it as if it's just a rectangular array of storage locations, which, as I mentioned, we refer to as pixels, picture cells. And we can think of the vertical axis, as I've shown, being the depth into the tissues, and the horizontal axis being distance along the face of the probe. So we'll just have a series of digital values stored in each of these memory locations, and those will tell the machine what grayscale value to display at the corresponding point. Obviously, there needs to be enough resolution, so there need to be enough bits to cover the full grayscale accurately and smoothly, and there need to be enough pixels so that the image is not compromised in its resolution. So the image memory is an area in the machine's memory where an individual image is stored, and it's stored very much the same as a photograph would be stored in a phone or computer. As I said, each memory location is referred to as a pixel. In practice, there are hundreds of these image memories, and that's because the machine has the capability of storing the images over a period of several seconds. When you hit the freeze button on the machine to stop imaging, you not only see the latest image, which is on your screen, but you have the ability to scroll back through several seconds of imaging to find exactly the right image to capture or measure. So if you're looking at something that's mobile, like an early fetus, or very dynamic, like a heart, you're able to capture the image and then scroll back to find the specific image of interest. This is an enormously useful function. So the controls which affect the image memory include, of course, the freeze function, cine loop that I've just described, the depth setting, because that determines how many centimeters of tissue are going to be stored in the image, and therefore it essentially determines the scale factor of the actual image. And then I've already mentioned the fact that we can zoom in on a specific area of anatomy. You may want to home in on the fetal heart, in which case you might want to zoom in and look only at the anatomy around the fetal thorax and ignore the rest of the anatomy. You can do this when you're scanning, and this, as I've indicated, is the preferred way of doing the zoom function. So while you're scanning, you can activate the zoom function identify the area of interest, and then the machine will expand up the image to cover only that anatomy. This has two advantages. First, the zoomed image will be stored in the entire image memory, so it'll be stored at very high resolution. And secondly, because the machine is only scanning a limited portion of the anatomy, it can do this quickly. And so the frame rate is very substantially increased if you zoom in on a small area instead of scanning the entire image area. So the right zoom function has significant advantages. It's called the right zoom because you're zooming before writing the echoes into the image memory. There is also a read zoom, which you apply to a stored image after it has been captured. And this, of course, is just magnifying up a portion of that stored image. You have absolutely no advantages in terms of frame rate or image resolution. When you do this, you are simply magnifying the image. So this tends to produce images that are pixelated if you magnify them too much. Here we have an example of the right zoom function. So in this case, I was scanning liver and kidney, and then I wanted to home in on a portion of the kidney. I selected that area and then imaged only that area on the right. You can see that the resolution is very good. There's no sign of pixelation here. And notice also that the frame rate on the left was 31 frames per second, or hertz, and on the right it is 79 hertz. So we've more than doubled the frame rate by homing in on a more limited area of the anatomy. I'd like now to talk about one block in the block diagram that was labelled pre-processing. This means processing of the echo signal before it is stored in the image memory. Examples of this would be your adjustment of the depth using a right zoom, which I've just described, the frame averaging function, which is where the machine averages more than one image together to produce the displayed image. So the machine captures the most recent image and then it averages that with the previous image. This function is also called persistence, and its purpose is to reduce speckle. So this smooths out the speckle appearance in soft tissue. The reason it does that is that in between one image and the next, there is usually at least a very small amount of movement of either the tissues or the probe, and this is sufficient to make the speckle functions in the first and second image different, so that when they're averaged together, the speckle becomes smoother. Another example of pre-processing would be compound imaging, where the machine obtains several images looking from different directions and then combines them together and stores the resultant in the image memory. So that's what the purpose of this pre-processing term is. It's a grab bag of different things that alter the echoes before they're stored in the image memory. And of course, these things are irreversible because they have altered the image that you're storing. In contrast, post-processing functions alter the way the stored image is displayed, so they can be turned on and off. They are reversible. Let me give you a few examples to clarify this. One example is what's often referred to as color mapping. And what this means is that the grayscale image is converted into an artificially colored image. The purpose of doing this is to make it easier to perceive variations in echo intensity. So some users find that color mapping makes it easier for them to see variations in soft tissue echo strength. Another example would be the read zoom that I talked about, where you magnify up a portion of the image and display that on the full screen. There are things called post-processing curves. These function in very much the same way as the dynamic range compression, which I described earlier, in that they modify how echo strength is converted into grayscale intensity on the screen. So they allow a little bit of tweaking, if you like, of the mapping of echo intensity to grayscale values. And then finally, you could include in this category measurements and annotation of the image. here is an example of colour mapping. We have an image of the liver and kidney. In fact, it's the same image you saw earlier. And then it has been converted into 4 different colours. As I said, the purpose is to try to make it easier to perceive variations in soft tissue echo intensity. Here we have a couple of examples of measurements being made in ultrasound images. On the left, we have a measurement of distance. The user has placed measurement markers on a mass. Notice the measurement is lateral. It's across the width of the image, and therefore it's significantly affected by the fuzziness of the edges of that mass due to beam width effect. This means there is a significant subjectivity in the exact positioning of those measurement markers. If you were to get 2 or more individuals to measure the same structure, they might well come up with significantly different answers because of this subjectivity. So this is a significant limitation of ultrasound measurements. The machine can compute the measurement with great accuracy. You can see it's displaying it to 2 decimal places. But it's very likely that there's an error of at least 5% in making this measurement because of the fact that it's a matter of judgment, just where you place the measurement markers. On the right, the operator has fitted an ellipse to a structure. They've then manipulated the shape of the ellipse to fit that as well as possible. Again, you have subjectivity in how this ellipse has been positioned, and this will affect accuracy of measurement. Measurements of area are particularly affected because you're then squaring the dimensional measurements, and therefore the error multiplies up. So this limitation on the accuracy of ultrasound measurements is really important. The figures produced by the machine may give you a deceptive idea of just how accurate the measurements are. Just a couple of words about the display and storage of the ultrasound image. The display is just a good quality display like a computer screen or a TV. Since the ultrasound image is digital, of course there's a host of different ways in which it can be stored. So it can be stored temporarily in the machine. So you can select some of the images as you're scanning a patient and store them temporarily in the machine to retrieve them later. In a department, a machine may well be connected to a network, and you may be able to store the images directly onto that network. This may also allow you to pull up previous images for comparison. You can store the images on removable media, magnetic or optical media, or a thumb drive. You can even print out images onto hard copy, paper or film, in order to attach an image to a report, for example. And particularly in echocardiography, it can be useful to record the displayed image using video recording. So you're recording what's being shown on the screen as a video, which then allows the reporting physician to play back selected parts of that and to actually watch the way in which the examination was done and the dynamics of it. So that can be very useful in echocardiography. So you can see there's a wide variety of techniques, and of course the images can be transmitted across the internet for remote reporting, telemedicine, etc. We've looked at the scan converter, the image memory, the pre- and post-processing functions, measurements, and most importantly the limitations in the accuracy of measurements, the display and storage of the final image. So that really brings us to the end of a description of what the machine does to create echoes and to turn those echoes into an image.